So let's go to chapter 23. Chapter 23. Before we start, first of all, I'm going to read the first verse. We're going to do a lot of, textual reading, actually the verses in chapter 23. But let's just read the first verse. Much later, after the Lord had given Israel rest from all the enemies around them, and when Joshua was old and well advanced in years. Okay, so this sets the stage for this chapter. A number of years have passed from everything that went before. And now we learn that Joshua was old. And what happens is chapter 23 is essentially a speech to the nation. Now, one of the things that we're going to be dealing with in the last class is chapter 24 is another speech to the nation. And so the question is, why two speeches? Were they both given at the same time? Those are the questions we're going to deal with during the next class. But for now, we take this as it is. And this clearly, the nature of the speech is very much, I'm at the end of my life. I'm wrapping up what we've done, giving you encouragement for the future, and giving you a very clear message of what is yet to be done. So before we go into the text of it, though, I want to kind of review what we've seen until now, because this is very, very important. As Joshua sums everything up, it's very important that we remember, okay, what basically is going on. Set aside all the stories of the wars and all the stuff that we did in the first 12 chapters. Let's just outline what we've done from chapter 13. Okay, so in chapter 13, very interesting. Take a look. Chapter 13, verse 1. We have a very, very similar first verse to what we just read. Joshua is now old, advanced in years. The Lord said to him, you have grown old, you are advanced in years, and very much of the land still remains to be taken possession of. Okay, so but between chapter 13 and between chapter 23 is 10 chapters. There already is even more time, because in chapter 23, it says years later. So it seems that 10 years earlier, Joshua was already old, okay? But he lives another 10 years, or he lives another number of years. We don't know exactly how many, okay? He lives another number of years. But it's interesting that chapter 13 also begins with this older Joshua who is giving some kind of instruction. What exactly is going on? So chapter 13 continues to talk about the 2.5 tribes that were given their territory on the eastern side of the Jordan. Going on to chapter 14, 15, 16, and 17, here we have the division of the land to an additional 2.5 tribes, to Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh. So at the end of chapter 17, we have the very specific, detailed territories of 5 tribes, okay? Judah, Ephraim, Manasseh, Reuben, and Gad, okay? That leaves us 7 tribes. Now, keep in mind, there were 12 sons of Joseph, okay? Joseph's 2 sons each get a territory, so that's 13, but we subtract Levi because he doesn't get a territory. So that's how we end up with 12, okay? Now, starting with chapter 18, we have the entire nation gathering in Shiloh. And we learn, if you just take a look quickly at chapter 18, verse 1. Where am I? Chapter 18, verse 1. The whole community of the Israelite people assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The land was now under their control, but there remained 7 tribes of the Israelites which had not yet received their portions. Okay, so for the next, so we have here for chapter 18, what happens is basically Joshua now sends those out. It's not just that they haven't yet received their portions, but the land for those 7 tribes have not been divided into 7 different territories. So what he does is he sends them out and he says, go map out the land, okay? They come back and they map out the land. And then we start with chapter 18, beginning in verse 9, until the end of chapter 19, we have the specific territories of the remaining 7 tribes, which is Benjamin, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan, okay? So when we get to the end of chapter 19, we have now divided the entire land. Everybody knows what their territory is. Chapter 20 was about these cities of refuge. That was kind of a parenthetical kind of thing. Chapter 21 is where we have the division of the Levite cities. By the end of chapter 21, we have completed all of the divisions. Everybody knows exactly what land they get. And let's read the very end of chapter 21. We've done this before, but just to remind ourselves, chapter 21, verse 41. The Lord gave to Israel the whole country, which he had sworn to their fathers that he would assign to them. They took possession of it and settled in it. The Lord gave them rest on all sides, just as he had promised to their fathers on earth. Not one man of all their enemies withstood them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hands. Not one of the good things which the Lord had promised to the house of Israel was lacking. Everything was fulfilled. Okay, so we have a picture here at the end of chapter 21 that everything is great, everything is finished, no more wars, everyone's settled, etc. Okay, chapter 22, of course, is what we dealt with last week. It's again a parenthetical story about the 2.5 tribes, a potential civil war that is avoided. Now we come to chapter 23, and we see from chapter 23 that things are not quite as good as the impression that was created at the end of chapter 21. Okay, so we're going to start doing that. And the other thing that we're going to be doing is, as we go through these verses, we're going to see that some of these verses are picking up on verses that we have previously in Joshua and also in other books of the Bible, particularly Deuteronomy. Okay, so let's start now with verse 2 in chapter 23. Joshua summoned all Israel, their elders and commanders, their magistrates and officials, and said to them, I have grown old and am advanced in years. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all those nations on your account. For it was the Lord your God who fought for you. Okay, now one of the things that we see here, where is it? 1 second. Okay, no, not yet. Verse 4. See, I have allotted to you by your tribes the territory of these nations that still remain, and that of all the nations that I have destroyed. From the Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, the Lord your God himself will thrust them out on your account and drive them out to make way for you, and you shall possess their land as the Lord your God promised you. Okay, so first of all, let's take a look at verse 3. In verse 3, he talks about the nations that still remain. Okay, and if you want to flip back, if not, just take my word for it. In chapter 13, where it starts out with again, Joshua is very, very old. In the first verse there, it says, and the land remains a great deal to inherit. And the same word is being used in Hebrew, nishara or nisheret, which means this idea of a remainder. Whether it's remaining nations or remaining land, there still remains a lot to inherit. So it seems here that what we have in chapter 13, though, is God saying to Joshua, don't rest yet. There still remains a lot of land to be inherited. And here, years later, we have Joshua saying to the nation, you know, a lot is still left to inherit. And so you have to wonder what was going on. I mean, Joshua immediately after, in chapter 13, as soon as God spoke to him and said there's still a lot of land to inherit, the rest of those chapters, we saw how he spent the time mapping out the land and dividing the land. Everybody got their territory, and it seems that everything would have been fine. And yet we see here that Joshua reviewing it all is saying, well, no, it's not so fine. There's still stuff that you haven't done. And in chapter 5, verse 5, where it says, the Lord your God will thrust them out on your account and drive them out to make way for you, and you shall possess their land. You get this sense that this is something that what Joshua is telling them is something they need to do. Okay, they're not supposed to sit by and just wait. He's giving them an instruction. It's a bit of a criticism here. He's saying, okay, I gave you your land, and there's still stuff there that you haven't settled. There is still stuff there that you haven't driven out the nations. Okay, and we discussed this all along, and we talked about the difference between conquering a whole area and saying, okay, it's now ours, and actually settling it. And in order to settle it, making sure you control every little meter of it, not just you have a political or security control over the whole thing. And if we are, and I see we are going to continue in Judges, we're going to see, particularly in Judges, how this is going to bite them. Okay, how the fact that they haven't completed the cleaning out of the land and making sure they control every bit of it, but there are still nations living in pockets within the land, how this is really going to get them. But this is something that Joshua sees at the end of his life, and it is of great concern to him. Okay. And then he goes on in verse 6. But be most resolute to observe faithfully all that is written in the book of the teaching of Moses, without ever deviating it from it to the right or to the left. Okay. Now I find this this is very interesting, because we see very, very similar. The language here is very similar to God's instruction to Joshua in chapter 1. What does he say? Let's go back. Chapter 1, verse 7. Be strong and resolute, for you shall apportion to this people the land that I swore to your fathers to assign to them. But you must be very strong and resolute to observe faithfully all the teaching that my servant Moses enjoined upon you. Do not deviate from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. This idea of having to be faithful and not deviating from the right to the left is basically Joshua here, as he's giving the instruction to the nation, is quoting what God initially told to him. Okay, verse 7. And without intermingling with these nations that are left among you. And here you can see clearly what is Joshua's concern. Is it his concern that they don't have enough strategic power, or they're not, they're going to have trouble dealing with enemies? That's not his concern. He's talking about intermingling of the nations above you. Even if these nations, let's say they no longer have armies, their armies have been decimated, and it's clear that the Israelites control the land, and yet these people are still there. And he's concerned about what? He's concerned about the influences. Do not utter the names of their gods or swear by them. Do not serve them or bow down to them, but hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. And this is, of course, this is of extreme concern to Joshua, that the fact that they remain among them could lead them to influence them to pagan worship, as opposed to what God wants them to be doing. Now, this reminds us very much to the kind of instructions that we saw in Deuteronomy. So let's go back to Deuteronomy 11. Deuteronomy 11, verse 22. If then you faithfully keep all this instruction that I command you, loving the Lord your God, walking in all his ways and holding fast to them, the Lord will dislodge before you all these nations. You will dispossess nations greater and more numerous than you. Okay? Every spot on which your foot treads shall be yours. Your territory shall extend from the wilderness to the Lebanon, and from the river, the Euphrates, to the western sea. No man shall stand up to you. The Lord your God will put the dread and fear of you over the whole land in which you set foot, as he promised. So this is something that's very reminiscent of what we saw here in verse 7 and 8. Let's see. No, it was what we're seeing in verse 9, excuse me. The Lord has driven out great powerful nations on your account, and not a man has withstood you to this day. A single man of you would put 1,000 to flight, for the Lord your God himself has been fighting for you, as he promised you. Now, first of all, you see this idea of no man standing up to you, okay? That God has, gotten rid of all these people. Where am I? But there's also something, this reminds me very much, where it says in verse 10, a single man of you would put 1,000 to flight. Okay, we have in Deuteronomy, when we have the punishment, we have the curses in chapter 28, we have the very opposite going on. Let's see, I didn't mark this, but I meant to mark it. So let me see if I can find it very, very quickly. Okay.
What are you looking for?
I'm looking for where it says that, here we go. Is this it? It says the opposite. It says that you will be chased by, 1,000 or by 500. Anyway, I'm not finding it now. It reminded me, and I meant to look for this scripture, but I can find it another time and send it to you by email. Anyway, what we're seeing here, though, is a reflection of the very concerns that Moses expresses to the nation in Deuteronomy, where he's saying, on the one hand, you have to be very careful to keep loyal to God, and if you do, you will then be successful in conquering the land. If you don't, you're going to have a problem. Now, keep in mind, and this is something I find extremely interesting, in verse 9, he says, no person will stand up before you, okay? And in verse, and then in Deuteronomy 11, in verse 25, we have a very similar word, no man will stand erect or stand before you. In Hebrew, it's not exactly the same word. In Joshua, we have the word amad, okay, stand. And in Deuteronomy, we have the word yitzyatzeh, which means more to like position himself or something. The actual meaning is very similar. It's not the exact word. We are celebrating Purim this week, and I find it extremely interesting that in the book of Esther, we have almost the same words as we have here in Joshua. We have the same words when at the end of the book of Esther, it talks about how the Jews are able to come and fight against those Persians who were trying to hurt them, okay? So if you have in front of you the book of Esther, chapter 9, at the end of verse 2, we have the same words, Ish lo amad lifnehem, no man stood against them. And it's exactly the same words as we have here in Joshua, in our chapter, in verse 9. It's exactly the same words, okay? No one stood before you. Now, what's very interesting is that in the Hebrew here, in most of the Bibles we have, it says lifnehem, and when we read the book of Esther out loud in the synagogue, there's a custom to read it two ways, lifnehem and bifnehem. One starts with an L sound, one starts with a B sound. They're very, they mean the same thing, okay? It's just two slightly different ways of saying the same thing. But what I find very interesting is in Joshua, it says bifnehem. And I have to wonder if there's a desire to ensure that we also read it the way it's written in Joshua, so that as if to kind of say, remember Joshua, where Joshua said no enemy would stand before you. So too in the book of Esther, and the end, of course, as a result of the miracle, no enemy stood before her. And you also have similar words in the book of Esther when they talk about the victory. One of the things they say, and this is also in chapter 9, and in several verses, also in verse 16, also in verse 22, they talk about resting from their enemies, and that is very similar to what we have in the book of Joshua in chapter 21, where it says, God had them rest from all over. And here we again have the same thing, and no man stood before them. So both in chapter 21 and in chapter 23, we have these similar words of no man standing before you, and that they're resting from their enemies. And we have the same thing in the book of Esther. And keep in mind, the book of Esther, of course, takes place, many, many hundreds of years later. And I think that it is an attempt in the book of Esther to kind of say, in the same way that there was this amazing miracle and the nation of Israel defeated their enemies and was now ready to launch the next step, to settle the land, etc. They're comparing that in many ways with the victory that it was in the book of Esther. Of course, the book of Esther, the victory takes place in Persia. I would like to think that there's a little hint there that says, okay, now things are good, get over to Israel. You could, this of course is what's going on in the book of Esther. It is already when the second temple period has begun, beginnings, the first people that came to Israel with Ezra, that's already having taken place when the book of Esther takes place. So that's just a little aside there. Okay, now let's continue in chapter 23. For your own sakes, I'm in verse 11. For your own sakes, therefore, be most mindful to love the Lord your God. Okay. Well, okay. I'm not sure I would translate this the same way. I would translate that you should look out very much for your own person, for your own body and soul. Okay. Body and soul, to love the Lord your God. The exact same words, and I mean the exact same words, are in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 15. Again, you should look very much after your own souls, okay? And here it says in verse 11, it's connected with the love of the Lord your God. In Deuteronomy 4:15, it's connected with, because you did not see any picture on the day the Lord your God spoke to you in Horeb from the fire, okay? So we have in Deuteronomy a connection between what are you supposed to be watching out for? You're supposed to be watching out for you against something pagan, because again, what is seeing a picture? The whole idea is that God is not a physical being, and the Bible is warning us against substituting gods that have a physical being, where a statue or a picture or something like that, for this Almighty God who we don't see. And so here we have the similar context, because look what happens next in verse 12. For should you turn away and attach yourselves to the remnant of those nations, to those that are left among you, and intermarry with them, you joining them and they joining you, know for certain that the Lord God will not continue to drive these nations out before you. They shall become a snare and a trap for you, a scourge to your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land that the Lord your God has given you. It is very clear that what Joshua here is talking about, and what he's so concerned about, is the fact that there's so much of the land that they have not yet settled. And the nations that remain in the land are pagan nations, that they can not only influence them, but you may end up intermingling with them. You may end up marrying them and joining with them. And therefore, you will leave your faithfulness to God and instead go and worship their gods. And he talks here about how that will happen. They shall become a snare and a trap for you. A snare and a trap. In other words, initially, you think, wow, these are nice people. You know, we can be neighborly. They're not trying to kill us anymore. We can be neighborly. What does Joshua say? It's a trap. It's a trap, because if you become too close with them and too friendly with them, you will start worshiping their gods. Now, this idea of the snare and the trap is also something we have seen before. In Deuteronomy 7, okay, Deuteronomy 7, and also in the book of Exodus. So let's start. We see it in a few places. So let's start with Deuteronomy 7, verse 14. Again. I'm in the right thing? No, I'm not in the right place. Excuse me. Yeah, Deuteronomy. Sorry, verse 16. Deuteronomy 7, verse 16. You shall destroy all the peoples that the Lord your God delivers to you, showing them no pity, and you shall not worship their gods, for that would be a snare to you. Okay, now let's look at Exodus 23. Exodus 23, verse 32. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not remain in your land, lest they cause you to sin against me, for you will serve their gods, and it will prove a snare to you. Okay, and if we're going to skip forward to Judges chapter 2, and this, of course, is what we're going to do next time, when we see how basically what we're seeing in Judges is that Joshua's worst fears actually come true. So look at Judges 2, verse 3. Therefore, I have resolved not to drive them out before you. They shall become your oppressors, and their gods shall be a snare to you. So this fear that Joshua is expressing here is a fear that we originally heard from Moses, and it is a fear that we're going to see play out in real life, that indeed, because they leave this land and they haven't continued to conquer it as extensively as they needed to, they're going to end up getting in trouble. Okay, now let's continue reading in our chapter. We are verse 14. I am now going the way of all the earth, which basically means I'm about to die. I'm old. Okay. Acknowledge with all your heart and soul that not one of the good things that the Lord your God promised you has failed to happen. They have all come true for you. Not a single one has failed. Okay. And this is something that reminds us very much of, first of all, of Moses before he dies, and he says to the nation, and this is in Deuteronomy 4, verse 22. One second. For I must die in this land, I shall not cross the Jordan, but you will cross and take possession of the good land. Take care then not to forget the covenant that the Lord your God concluded with you, and not to make yourselves a sculptured image in any likeness. It's very, very similar. And Moses says, I'm about to die. This is the most important thing. Don't worship pagan gods. And we see this is something that also Joshua is very much focusing on. Okay, now let's continue. One more thing. He says nothing has changed from what God said he was going to do for you. We saw that also initially in chapter 21, verse 43. We say this. We see the same thing where God says, we see the same thing. Nothing. Everything that God promised would happen, almost in the same language. That's chapter 21, verse 43. Okay, now let's continue. 15, but just as every good thing that the Lord your God promised you has been fulfilled for you, so the Lord can bring upon you every evil thing until he has wiped you off this good land that the Lord your God has given you. If you break the covenant that the Lord your God enjoined upon you and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you shall quickly perish from the good land that he has given you. And this is very, very similar to what we just read in Deuteronomy 4. And I will continue. Yeah, I think we read this already about how if you, one second, I don't think I got as far as that. Deuteronomy 4, verse 25. When you have begotten children and children's children and are long established in the land, should you act wickedly and make for yourself a sculptured image in any likeness, causing the Lord your God displeasure and vexation, I call heaven and earth this day to witness against you that you shall soon perish from the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess. You shall not long endure in it, but shall be utterly wiped out. Very, very similar to what Joshua is saying now. Okay, so what do we see as a whole here? Okay, so first of all, it's very clear that Joshua was concerned that they haven't conquered the rest of the land. And his main concern is the evil influence that these pagan nations can still exert over the nations of Israel. They can become a snare, they can become a trap. And he's warning them, even as much as Moses warned them before they entered the land. If you end up going, following pagan gods, the Lord will destroy you. You won't succeed, whatever. Here, after they've already conquered the land, Joshua is saying, don't think it's not reversible. You can feel calm now. You run the wars and God brought his miracles and you've already conquered the land and everything is good. But Joshua is saying, number one, you didn't finish. There's still pieces of the land that you've got to get rid of these people and completely conquer. And number two, he's saying it's reversible. If you don't finish the job and if you don't continue to be faithful to God, God can you shall quickly perish from the good land that he has given you. This is reversible. Okay. Now, of course, we know this from Deuteronomy 30 more than anywhere else in this, what we've done so far, that it's reversible, but still there is an irrevocable connection between God and the land of Israel and the nation of Israel. Okay. So it's reversible in the sense that God can throw you out, but of course, God has also promised he will bring us back. Okay, so we always have to keep that in mind, but Joshua is not telling them, but don't worry, you'll keep your back, because he's trying to impress upon them how serious the situation is and how they really have to move forward and get going. Okay, now One thing that we have here is this constant fear of pagan worship. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, a lot of this warning is happening very shortly after, just a matter of weeks after the terrible sin of Baal Peor, which was the major sin of the second generation. The first generation, we had the golden calf. That was bad enough. And we had other problems, okay? But then they die out. The major sin of the second generation, a generation we believe is much more righteous. They don't have all the complexes of the first generation, and they're ready to go into the land. And yet, even in that generation, there's this real fall when some of the nation end up being influenced and swayed to go to this worship of Baal Peor, as the Midianite and Moabite women lure some of the men of Israel into that worship. And that, of course, is a terrible tragedy. And many, many people die in that plague that God brings as a punishment. You get the sense, therefore, as Moses talks to the nation before they enter the land, that this is very much in his head. Okay, I saw what happened. I saw what happens when the nation is influenced, is swayed to go after pagan worship. Look how terrible this is. And so that's very much in his head, and very much, I assume, in the minds and hearts of the nation as they're listening to us. They've just witnessed this terrible, terrible thing. Here's Joshua many years later. Okay, Joshua, just as a matter of reference, Joshua is, according to Jewish sources, Joshua was 42 years old when he left Egypt. He was 82 years old when he entered the land. Okay, and he's 110 when he dies. So the book of Joshua roughly takes 28 years, okay? Which means that it is approximately 28 years from that Baal Peor incident and Joshua. It's quite a long time. A lot of other things have happened along the way. So I can't say that Baal Peor has that same immediate effect, but I think the teaching is there from Moses, the teaching that perpetuates the risk, the threat that a Baal Peor or that a pagan worship poses, is immortalized in Moses's words. And those are the words that Joshua has and that he understands as he sees for himself that not all the land is conquered. He sees Canaanites are still about them, and he understands very deeply what this risk is. And that is his most important message to the nation as well. That's today's lesson. Very important message of Joshua to the nation before he dies. Next lesson, we're going to see the last one, which is a little different, another speech. But this is a time, if any of you have questions, open your mics and ask.
Probably not a question, more sort of a query I get. Can you sort of see a relation similar to today? Like, I know you can't just kick the Arabs out of Israel, but the same type of thing, like, you know, the appeasement and, you know, being, I don't know. You think there's a bit of a correlation similar to
I'll tell you the truth.
in Israel?
I'll tell you, okay, first of all, many people have asked that question in terms of what is our status in Israel today. On the one hand, we believe God gave us the land. God has seen us successful in the wars. Are we supposed to be throwing out the Arabs? Most people will say no. I would say every single rabbi who respects himself will say no. You know, all of the important rabbis will say absolutely no, unequivocally. And I think what the main reason for that theologically is there isn't, to do something like that, you need a very direct instruction. And Moses gave that instruction from God. But we don't have that direct instruction today. So that's not just something you do. But I would say that the lessons of what Joshua is saying are very potent. I have to say, okay, the fact that we have Arabs living among us, first of all, Arabs are not pagan. They have a different faith, but they're not bowing down to idols and, you know, rocks and stones, and they're not having child sacrifices in the way that they did in pagan times. But I have to say very clearly, something that we see is so different. In biblical times, this idea of pagan worship was an enormous attraction to the children of Israel, something that we today cannot relate to at all. That whole attraction to pagan worship is just like it's not there. So very interestingly, if you would think that there would be a theological issue or religious influence, it's not there. I mean, you're not finding Jews in Israel that are saying, oh, wow, let's become Muslims. It's not happening. So this idea of another nation living amongst us that have a religious hold or can attract us away from God, that we're not seeing at all. So the challenges are completely different. Our challenges today are much more of a security challenge than it is of some kind of assimilationist or religious influence or something like that. So that's why I think it is very, very different.
But do you think there are other idols? Like, sort of the isms. I mean, I'm thinking how similar it can be in the church, how many idols we have. And it's cause and effect, that if you do such and such is likely to happen. And I think that it's a different sort of idolatry now.
Well, I do agree that there are influences that we all face that you can say are similar to idolatry. That is not the same, okay? Because from a theological point of view, there was a real issue in competing with God. I think when people are, for example, there are people who say it's a tremendous influence, materialism, okay? People will do so much in the service of making more money. And so that becomes a priority for them as opposed to true values and stuff like that. But nobody believes that money created the world. Nobody believes that money defines your fate in life, okay? So it is an influence, but it doesn't become a theological or a replacement for the divine. So I think there's certain similarities, but you don't have that same thing of competing with God type thing. But I do agree that there are influences, and I think
which turn you away from God. I mean, it's not competing; it's just turning away.
Exactly. I agree with that 100%. I see, April, you wrote, humanism is a religion, man is their God. I don't think they think man is their God. I think they think there is no God.
Yeah.
And that every man can decide for themselves what they want to do. So I think the greatest challenge that we all face today, and I don't think it has anything to do with whether we're in Israel or anywhere else or who are our neighbors, but the greatest challenge that people of all faith face is secularism. Is this idea that there is no God, is the idea that I can do what I want just because I think it's right, or I think that this is what is more important.
Relativism.
So overwhelming,
the eye.
Shannon, I mean, Sondra, I belong to a group of people who listen in to a rabbi who does a Torah study. And towards the end of it, a couple of weeks ago, I was so stunned. I thought, I'll never come back to this group. He said, I do not worship God. He says, now that we know about atoms and protons and neutrons, and he's thinking of creation, I mean of the Big Bang, I think.
Right.
He says, I worship man and Torah.
And what?
Torah.
Well, how do you worship man and Torah? That doesn't
make sense.
Because he claims it's all man written. He believes there's mostly just stories. Now, this is a rabbi from a Reform synagogue.
Okay, so he's Reform. Now, I will tell you that many Reform rabbis believe in God, okay, but some don't. And I don't know which is the majority. If the majority believe in God, the majority don't. I would like to believe Reform rabbis do not believe that the Bible was written by God. That's true.
Yeah.
They believe it was written by men, but they do believe there is a God, master of the universe, shall we say. Most of them, but I guess some of them don't. But that's not who we are, okay?
No, I know you're not.
Yeah.
But that's the danger.
Of course. So, but no question, it goes together, whether you call yourself Reform or whether you call yourself, I don't know, anything, humanist or whatever it is. People have different names. But if you don't believe in God and you don't believe, however you're going to call him, okay? If you don't believe in God and you believe that, these other values, which are competing values, are more important. Also, if you'll notice, for example, I think all of us will agree, humanism as it states itself, okay, their biggest concern is to look out for their fellow human beings, okay? Who doesn't agree with that? We all agree. I mean, God says he created man in his image. And that means every single human being is created in God's image, and therefore we're all brothers. We are all humanity. We should be looking after one another. And God says, you need to be holy because I'm holy, which means we're supposed to try to mimic God in his attributes. When we see God is taking mercy, we want to take mercy. God told us to look after the poor and the needy, and this is something we need to be doing. So that, in that sense, we could say, yes, are we all humanists? But the question is, are you doing these things because there is a greater authority, a world that God created, and we're all responsible for one another? Or are you a humanist because you say, I'm going to see the world the way I see it, okay? And anybody else, you know, forget it, which is in practice what so many humanists say. They will make fun of people of faith because they'll say, you're idiots, you don't know what you're talking about. And we have it, we look at things differently, and then it comes to all kinds of skewed and unjust results, you know. Even if you look at the situation in Israel, the conflict between Israel and the Arabs, or Israel and the Palestinians, okay, so much of that means go back in history. Go back to see who owned the land first. But if somebody will say, I don't care about history, it doesn't matter. I'm just looking at two people now. One has more money, one has less money. I need to care more for the person who has less money. Now, what if the person who has less money doesn't deserve what you're wanting to give him? You know, so it's such a narrow way of looking at things without realizing, hey, wait, maybe we don't see it all. Maybe there's a bigger picture here that we're not seeing.
Right.
Okay, that was a good point. Anybody else have any comments that they want to make? Okay, well, it was great to see you all this week. And again, we will not be meeting for the next 2 weeks. And we will meet again on April 4th. And that we will, please God, be finishing the book of Joshua with chapter 24.
Well, happy Purim and safe travels to the US.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lesia Tova.
Thank you.
Lesia
you again
Tova.
soon.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.